presentation here. And share. Well, great. Thank you again, Sam, for hosting this event. I'm glad that we can be part of it again. As Sam mentioned, my name is Tracy Sears, and I'm with the Montana DNRC. I'm the Montana National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for the state of Montana. Also within our Community Assistance Program, we have Shalia Wingard, and she is a new addition to our staff. But both of us are available if you have any questions that happen to come up, if you're looking at information about building in a floodplain, or if you're looking at insurance information. I encourage you to talk to your local floodplain administrator, Sam, first, but we're also available as well. So I think before we kind of dive into the regulations, I think it's really important to kind of discuss how this program evolved and some of the and kind of why the regulations have been established the way that you see in your local floodplain ordinances. Most of us live near water. Most communities were actually developed near water. And before the National Flood Insurance Program was implemented, what was done was to prevent flooding was actually looking at flood control structures. So we see quite a few of these around the state and around the nation. We see a lot of dams that were kind of erected to try to help prevent flooding, and we've seen a lot of levees that were actually around quite a few communities nationwide as well. And those levees have provided, for the most part, a lot of protection from some of these flood events. But what was happening was that they were seeing an increase in development in these high risk or flood prone areas. And unfortunately, disaster relief payouts for flood damages was also increasing. So a lot of the lenders were looking at ways to kind of protect their assets, and they're looking at mortgages, and if there were flood events that were occurring, people unfortunately were walking away from their properties and they would end up back with the lender. The other thing that was happening was that the availability of flood insurance on the private market was non-existent, especially in these high risk areas. So there was a concern nationwide of what to do. We know that there's a risk. How do we mitigate this risk? And more importantly, how can we help those property owners mitigate their risk? That's where we enter the National Flood Insurance Program. So in 1968, the federal government came up with this program. Even though it has insurance in the program, what it was developed as was a unified program. And they were looking at different aspects to kind of work together. So they were looking at mapping, they were looking at regulations, they were looking at mitigation, and they were looking at the availability of flood insurance, understanding that, again, flood insurance wasn't available in the private market. On the National Flood Insurance Program, what it was and what it is an agreement between the federal government, not only making subsidized flood insurance available within the community, but also offering disaster or assistance after disasters occur. But it's between that federal government and that local community. And the commitment the local community has with the federal government is to adopt and enforce floodplain regulations that meet or exceed the state and federal regulations. Now, they say this is a voluntary program, but as more communities were mapped, there was understanding that if those communities knew their risk and they weren't managing their risks, certain things wouldn't be available. So we do see quite a few communities, especially around the state of Montana, that actually participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And it's good to understand that FEMA is the one that actually administers the National Flood Insurance Program. And at the state, what we do is the state of Montana back in the 70s established a program where there was a state entity that was actually going to try to help the local communities administer these programs, because they understood that this was probably going to be pretty complicated. And so what we do is we try to work with local communities and property owners on any questions and concerns that they might have, not only about the National Flood Insurance Program, but we also try to help them understand the regulations and help those communities stay in compliance with the program. But the local communities are ones that have the biggest lift. They're the ones that actually have to enforce the National Flood Insurance Program requirements through a local floodplain ordinance. when we talk about this unified program, one of the biggest principles in this is talking about no adverse impact. So when they're looking at what was occurring in these high-risk areas, they wanted to make sure that whatever would occur in the future would not affect adjacent property owners, and hopefully it would lead to the reduction of flood losses throughout the local community. As I mentioned before, the National Flood Insurance Program actually has 4 parts to this unified program. You have the mapping, the regulations, the insurance, and mitigation. So the first thing to look at is the mapping. That area that we depict as that high-risk area is also called the Special Flood Hazard Area. Some of you might know it as the FEMA 100-year floodplain, but really what it is that area that has a 1% chance of flooding any given year. So this is that area that there's a concern that as more development goes in, what is that impact going to be, not only to the community, but to adjacent property owners and to that property owner as well. So when we look at that special flood hazard area, especially here in Miles City, what Miles City has is what we call a detailed study. So there's certain areas in that special flood hazard area that have been identified. You have what they call the floodway and the flood fringe. I always like to describe that floodway as that area that they're going to see the deeper depths and the higher velocities. And of course, that flood fringe is that area of the floodplain that can be encroached upon and used for, you can see some development that occurs in there as well. But working together, there are different regulations that pertain to those areas in the floodway, as most of you are well aware. And there's different regulations that pertain in that flood fringe. Understanding that that floodway is the area that you're probably going to see the most damages and losses due to flooding. So how to identify these special flood hazard areas? In the beginning of this program, what they utilized were floodplain maps that were going to depict what these high-risk areas were. And so we refer to these maps, especially here in Miles City, as the flood insurance rate maps, and they're used for a variety of things. One of them is to identify the areas of flood risk, which we kind of already discussed, but they could be used by emergency management to understand what roads might be inundated during a flood event. They could be used for mitigation projects to try to figure out if you want to reduce that flood risk, maybe projects that can kind of help you with that as well. They could also be utilized in planning. And there's different levels of detail really depending on the area. A lot of our communities actually have an approximate study area. It's the special flood hazard area is defined, but really there's no elevations that are associated with it. And sometimes there's not really a strong study that backs that flood insurance rate map that only has that approximate study. Then we have some communities that have limited detailed study. They have the special flood hazard area that's been defined, and it may include base flood elevations or those elevations that are trying to identify where you want to build to. They also might have profiles or base flood elevations published in what they call flood insurance study. And lastly is that detailed study. And this is what, again, Miles City actually has. That special flood hazard area has been identified. They have base flood elevations. They have information about the floodway, about the flood fringe, and also what they would call that 500-year floodplain is located. So what does that kind of look like? Here is just an example of a digital flood insurance rate map, similar to the one here in Miles City. And you can see that area that has those red stripes is what they see as the floodway. So that area that has the highest chance of flood damage and loss. And outside of that, you have the flood fringe, which is in blue. Now this area that's located, that's the brown area, that's what we call the 500-year floodplain, or the 0.2% annual chance flood hazard. So this is an area that most folks they won't need to get a permit to build in, but it is an area that if you're looking at doing critical facilities for a community, whether it be like a hospital or a fire department, chances are they'll locate outside of even this 500-year floodplain as well. So that 500-year floodplain is really important, especially when it comes to critical facilities. And it's also identified as a moderate risk area. So as we mentioned earlier, in order to kind of participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, states and communities must adopt and enforce regulations that meet or exceed the federal and state regulations. Now, the federal regulations are specified in what they call the Code of Federal Regulations. And those regulations are based off the level of detailed map provided for your community. I thought this was really important to kind of bring up as we get into the nuts and bolts of when we're going into some of the projects that you might see in the floodplain. So a big thing too is that the regulations are actually tied to that local ordinance. I'm sorry, your local ordinance is actually tied to your local maps that depict that high risk area. They're linked together. And one of the things that they're looking at when we were already talking about that no adverse impact is one of the big areas of concern is the encroachment. What is that development going to do to the area surrounding that particular project, to the property that project's located on, and to the community as a whole? So different projects can have big impacts. One of the other things that we wanted to bring up is that in the state of Montana, there's some higher standards. The first one we wanted to kind of point out was what we call the freeboard standard. So since the 70s, the state of Montana actually had the higher standards that have been adopted by the local communities that require any new development to be elevated, have what they call freeboard of at least 2 feet above that base flood elevation. And what does that kind of look like? You can see here, the top picture shows that this structure was built with no freeboard. And if there's any changes to that base flood elevation as development kind of occurs in this area, unfortunately what will happen is that over time, the lowest floor of this home will actually end up going below that base flood elevation. Now, we do see folks use a variety of ways to elevate their home. The second one that we see, or their structures, is freeboard, but it's based on structures that were elevated on post. The third one is what we see a lot in the state of Montana here, and that's the freeboard based on being elevated on fill or natural ground. Hold on just one second here. Okay. So the local regulations and state regulations, it's not that you can't build, but they do require that you need to build differently, especially in these high risk areas or even around these high risk areas. And so there's processes that have been established as far as what's required for permitting. So one of the basic floodplain regulations that comes out of the federal requirements is that any development, any type of man-made activity should go through a permitting process. So there should be an application that's submitted to that local community, and we'll get into that in just a little bit here. And that application should be evaluated by the local community and a permit issued for that project. And the big thing that they're looking for, again, is that how that project is designed. Is it going to increase flooding on adjacent properties and within the community? Is it built safely? Is it going to be able to withstand that 1% flood event? The other requirement that puts a big burden on that local floodplain administrator is that under the federal requirements, they state that all required local, state, and federal permits have to be approved before that floodplain application is considered complete and before that floodplain administrator can actually issue a permit or make a decision on a permit. So that's one that that's one where if you have done a project, especially in any community that's participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, this is the last permit that you'll receive. And sometimes it could take a little bit longer. And one of the big reasons on that is because of this federal requirement about all other applicable permits. One of the nice things that's happened in the state of Montana is that back in the 90s, all the state and federal agencies kind of got together to create one permit application that communities could use. And part of that process, they actually developed a guidebook to developing in and around streams in Montana. And so this information is available. I know in Miles City, they have hard copies available for the stream permitting guide, but they also have them online. The state also has information online on the stream permitting guide. And that way you can utilize this guide to find out, one, what might be required if you're doing a project on your property, and what permits might be required as well. And so it's just a really handy tool, and should be, if you're looking at developing, I would really encourage you to either download it or get a copy of it from Miles City. We also, at the state, keep a copy of the most up-to-date joint application. And so you can find that on our website, and we'll make sure we have this available after the presentation, or put it in the chat box for you so that you can kind of access this information, and mainly for that joint application and the instructions. And of course, we also have a copy of the floodproofing form, which we will kind of touch base on here in just a little bit. But this is what that joint application looks like. And I know Miles City, as well as almost all of the other 137 communities that participate in the program, they utilize this application for any proposed work. That's even if you're in that special flood hazard area, this is the application that you're going to want to fill out and submit to your local floodplain administrator. And as you can see, you have the different permits that might be applicable in your area. A lot of the permits that are required here, especially in Miles City, that are listed here from the other agencies, might not be required for Miles City, but it's always good to kind of review and check. And I would really encourage you to reach out to Sam to kind of go over this information and what might be required for your project. So one of the questions that we get a lot is, can we build an addition onto our home in a zone A? And you can, but a floodplain permit will be required. Now, this is a tricky part about building additions or building onto an existing structure in that special flood hazard area. At minimum, you not only would need that permit like we mentioned, but that addition will need to be elevated 2 feet above that base flood elevation. If your addition is going to increase the value of that structure by more than 50%, you may also have to elevate the entire structure. So when you're looking at trying to do additions on your home, and I'll have a little diagram here in a moment to kind of show you, you really should be working with your floodplain administrator, Sam, as soon as possible, because she could help you through that process and maybe provide you some additional information that makes that permitting process go a lot smoother. Oops. So this is kind of what it looks like here. This isn't a lateral addition, and this is a little bit fuzzy, but what you can see here is that they were adding an addition onto their home, but that addition did not increase the value of that structure by more than 50%. And so what that did was it only required that lateral addition to get the permit. And then again, that addition had to be raised. In the state of Montana, it's 2 feet above that base flood elevation. But you can see what that looks like to that existing home. Now, if that addition were going to meet what they call that substantial improvement threshold, so that's increasing the value of that structure by more than 50%, then the entire structure would have had to be raised to 2 feet above that base flood elevation. This is also tricky when we're looking at vertical additions. If you have an existing structure that was constructed in compliance at the time that it was built, but now you can see on the left side, it shows that the structure, that lowest floor, is now below that base flood elevation. Typically, if you're going to do a vertical addition, that's going to trigger that substantial improvement requirement, and that entire structure would have to be elevated 2 feet above that base flood elevation. So I'm hoping that these visuals kind of give you a little bit understanding when you're working in and around the floodplain, and especially when you're dealing with structures here. Another component of the flood insurance application and also the permit is the elevation certificate. These are used once the structure has received a permit and has been it has been completed, the structure has been completed. What's required is its elevation certificate to show that it met all of the requirements in the permit. So that structure it's demonstrating that the structure's elevation is at that lowest floor is 2 feet above that base flood elevation, and it's tied to a structure. But this can be completed by a registered surveyor or an engineer. But this is going to be required, and especially as Sam mentioned, the Miles City is actually part of what we call the community rating system. It's actually a reward program for communities that go above and beyond the minimum federal standards. And Miles City has done a tremendous amount of work, especially with their PPI group, to actually try to get a better classification under the community rating system. And part of the requirements of being a CRS community is that any new structure that's built, any additions, would also need to have an elevation certificate submitted for the community to verify the information and be in good standing under the CRS program. So this gives a little bit of info. This is just giving you a little snapshot on what information is required for an elevation certificate. They're going to ask what the elevation is of the top of the bottom floor. They're going to ask what the elevation is of an attached garage. They're going to ask what the elevation is around the structure. So what that lowest adjacent grade is next to the building. This is all information. Some of you are probably familiar with this if you have built in Miles City, but this is all the information that will be reviewed by that local floodplain administrator to make sure that that structure was built in compliance with the permit that was issued. This information is also then reviewed not only by our office, but also when the community does recertification for that community rating system program. They actually have reviewers that will be looking at all this information to make sure that it's, accurately filled out and that there's no issues or flags from any of the structures that had been built within the community. The other thing that we see elevation certificates used with, they can be used with the letter, what they call letter of map amendment. We have some areas, and I know Miles City has quite a few structures that have received letter of map amendments, that those structures, the ground that they were built on is actually naturally above what they call that base flood elevation. So we see a lot of times where property owners with existing structures might request to do an elevation certificate, and then they utilize that information to apply for what they call a letter of map amendment. And what that letter of map amendment does for that property owner, it actually, if it is approved through FEMA, that letter of map amendment actually takes that property out of what they call that special flood hazard area. It takes it out for insurance purposes, I should say. But it does provide additional information about that base flood elevation around that structure. And again, I just want to really emphasize that that letter of map amendment is based on that natural grade. That means that no fill has been placed there, that naturally that area that they're looking at is above that special flood hazard area. So these letter of map amendments, we see this a lot with the regulations. They're tied to a structure or a piece of land, and they're used by property owners, as I mentioned before, to be relieved of their flood insurance requirement. And it also demonstrates that that structure elevation is actually above, and maybe they don't need to get, maybe they're trying to consider if they can actually build in that location. It does require elevation data, and that's where we see that elevation certificate kind of be pulled into it. Now, letters of map amendments have to be prepared by a surveyor or engineer, but the nice thing is that it's free to submit to FEMA. They don't charge a fee to submit this letter of map amendment. So really the only cost is if you have to hire a surveyor or engineer to prepare this information. And this is what this is what we call a letter of map amendment determination document. So this is what you would probably receive, saying that yes, we think that this portion of property that was identified is above, naturally above that special flood hazard area, and it's going to be removed from that mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. Now, we do also see some structures in the flood fringe that actually bring in fill, as we mentioned earlier, that they want to elevate that structure and meet that 2 foot of freeboard based on fill. Now, they also have a process where they can get out of that mandatory insurance requirement in the special flood hazard area by actually submitting what they call a letter of map revision based on fill. So there's different ways that a property owner can look at not only reducing their risk, but also hopefully being able to lessen their insurance premium and maybe give them more options. Maybe they don't want to purchase the federal flood insurance. Maybe they want options on purchasing private insurance at a lower cost. All of these things are kind of go into when you're looking at development in and around that special flood hazard area. Now, since Miles City actually has a digital flood insurance rate map, this information about LOMAs in the area should be located on the National Flood Hazard Layer, which is an online product through FEMA. And again, we can provide that information to you on how you can access information. But you can see if you're looking in your area, if other properties or structures have utilized that letter of map amendment process, and you can kind of find out where they're located. Kind of gives you an idea if maybe naturally the area that you live in might be a little bit higher than what's depicted on the maps. Now, I wanted to show this this slide here, because we do have a large area that has existing structures in what they call that floodway area. And as I mentioned before, there's some restrictions on what you can do in that floodway. One of the things that if you're looking at trying to add on to an existing home, one of the things that you can look at is where that addition is going. Is it in what they call a conveying shadow? And the importance of this is just, again, part of that determination on how that addition is going to affect adjacent property owners, how it's going to affect the special flood hazard area, if it's going to raise BFEs in that area, if it's going to create issues for the existing property owner. If they add on that addition, is it going to be at risk of flood damage or flood loss? And this is just one of the items that, or this is one of the ways that a property owner can submit information saying, look, we do have an existing house, we want to do an addition, and we think that this addition is what is located in what we call that conveying shadow. Again, I know this is terminology you might not have heard before. I really encourage you to work with Sam or that local floodplain administrator to kind of understand this a little bit more if you have homes in these areas and you're looking at possibly doing an addition on that home. The other area to really look at if you're looking at doing projects in the local community is your local floodplain regulation and what those requirements are. As I mentioned before, the community, just to join and to be in good standing with the program, they have to meet the state and federal minimum standards. Now, some local communities actually have some higher standards as well. So it's really important that you are familiar with your local floodplain regulation requirements. And again, it goes back to talking with your local floodplain administrator to make sure you kind of understand what regulations and requirements are going to be applicable to your project. When new maps are updated, you remember I was mentioning how the maps are tied to those local regulations. When maps are updated, like they were here in Miles City back in 2010, then the regulations also need to be updated to show that newer jurisdictional area. And there's a process that the local regulations kind of go through. And there's folks at FEMA and then in our office at DNRC that also end up reviewing those regulations and make sure they're compliant with the state and federal regulations as well. So what does it mean to be in the high-risk floodplain? If you're in that mapped area that shows that you're in that high risk or that special flood hazard area, any of those structures with a mortgage will need flood insurance. And also, if you're doing any type of man-made development on that property, a floodplain permit is required. Now, if you're in a moderate risk floodplain in Miles City, flood insurance is recommended. Now, we do always mention that a lender can choose at any time to require flood insurance on any property. But if you are in that moderate flood risk floodplain, it's not part of that mandatory flood insurance requirement. And so again, another lender may choose not to require it. But again, lenders can choose it anywhere they want. If they think that there's a flood risk, they can require that flood insurance if you have a loan with them. Now, no floodplain permit for Miles City is required for development in these moderate risk areas. And that's that area that was in the brown on the map that we showed earlier that we called like the 500-year floodplain or the 0.2% annual flood. So we kind of talked a little bit about some of the regulations for developing, especially structures in the floodplain. We want to get in the permitting really quick, and then we'll kind of go over how all of this is tied into that community rating system and how it can affect your premiums. So when you're submitting a floodplain permit application, the key documents, of course, are going to be that joint application. There's another document that's specific to floodplain permit application, and that should be located on that local, the local floodplain website. Also, the site for the state that I showed earlier that we'll put in the chat box. You can pull up the submittal requirements for floodplain permit application, and there's a whole section especially for doing additions or building structures in these areas. The other one I like to mention is that most local floodplain administrators will utilize this floodplain permitting checklist, and that pretty much follows along with their regulations and kind of what's required to evaluate that application that's submitted for any projects that are being proposed in that special flood hazard area. And so this is just a little bit further dive into that joint application. And this is what communities need to really evaluate projects. One of the things I like to talk to to floodplain administrators about is if they receive an application, they want to make sure that they can understand it. They can understand where, who's proposing the project, where the project's located, what they're going to do as part of this proposed project, and what materials they use. Anyone should be able to pick up this floodplain application and understand not only where it's located, but what's being proposed, how much of the area is going to be impacted. There shouldn't be any missing information, and that's what they're going to be evaluating at the local level. They're going to be looking to make sure that this application is filled out completely, especially for this project. Now, they could request any additional information. They might ask for building plans. They might ask for information about the driveway. If you're on a stream, they might ask for information. If you're doing what we call like a riprap project, I don't think there's too many here in Miles City, but they could ask for information about what type of rock is going to be used. Is that rock going to be secured or keyed in, that it's going to be able to withstand that 1% flood event? So on that front page, that basic information they're looking for, the applicant information, they'll also ask, for that contractor or agent. A lot of times, a property owner will have a contractor or agent that submits this information. They'll also look for the project site information. And then they're going to be asking what type of project. Is this dealing with a bridge or a culvert? Is it a commercial structure? Is it placement of fill? And some projects could check off quite a few of these boxes, especially if you're building, let's say you're building a residential structure, you're going to add fill. You might do a culvert because you're going to do a driveway to that structure. So there might be multiple things that are kind of checked off. But in this, they're also going to ask you for the plan or drawings to be part of that application for evaluation. What was the purpose of the project? All of this information is going to be included in that application. So there's a couple of places that they'll be asking for that project information. You want to really make sure that you fill this out completely. And if not, that local floodplain administrator is probably going to call you back and say, we're going to need some additional information. Now, there's also a section here that's going to require information about all those other applicable permits that may be required. And the big one on here too is that they're going to make sure that these applications are signed. There is information for the application. There's actually instructions that go along with that joint stream application. Really encourage you to kind of read that. And then of course, those submittal requirements that we mentioned earlier, those would be really, really helpful as you're looking at not only putting together an application, but building a structure. And so these are some of the submittal requirements: a list of adjacent property owners, a signature or letter from each property owner. It's just the basic information as if you were doing any type of project that might be required for evaluation so that they can make their decision. And what I find across the state, and the same here with Sam, is most of the floodplain administrators, they're there to help you. They want to see you have a successful project go through. And so they're a huge resource. Talk to them early before you even submit that application. But this is that submittal requirements, what's going to be required. And this just, again, it helps that community make that final decision on that application. So now once you receive, you've gone through that application process, hopefully you talked to Sam prior to that. Now you're looking at that permit that has been issued. And so now you're looking at the construction inspection. And so what that local floodplain administrator is going to do is they're going to first, once they receive your application, is go out and conduct a first inspection. They're going to take a look at the site. And hopefully once the site is staked out, if need be, and before the ground is broken, They're going to take a look around at what's going on there. And then the second inspection really should be conducted just before the installation of the lowest floor. That way, you have an understanding of making sure that you are meeting those permit requirements that were issued, but also that you have a second set of eyes. So, I mean, once that lowest floor is installed, it's really important for the community to do that second inspection. So you'll see that local floodplain administrator a few times. And of course, that third inspection could be near completion. A lot of times we'll see that third inspection after the structure has been completely built. But this third inspection is, again, it's really important because that provides information at floodplain administrator that, yes, that this construction does comply with the plans. They'll be taking a look at the HVAC placement, the openings, anchoring system, and they'll also they will be requesting an as-built elevation as well. So the floodplain administrator is going to coordinate with the owner and builder. They're going to be asking for that documentation that we've kind of discussed, either the elevation survey, the compaction test results if they're using fill, the plan stamped by engineers or architect, and certified enclosure openings. And really, hopefully they'll have those plans in hand and know that property before they go out there. And I know that Sam does that. She knows this area quite well. They'll probably be taking photos, lots and lots of photos. And when they're on site, of course, that's the biggest thing, is we encourage them to be safe. So what does this mean as far as being the property owner as you're going through this process, and why all of these requirements? The main premise of the National Flood Insurance Program is to reduce flood losses and flood damage. And so these regulations are established to make sure that people that are building in and around these areas are building safely. Most structures, especially residential structures, have a lifespan of about 170 years. That's multiple owners. And the impact of to a community once a flood event occurs can be extremely dramatic. And if a structure is damaged, it's very, very difficult to not only rebuild, but it's really difficult for that property owner that's kind of going through that. In the 1990s, during the flooding that occurred in the Midwest, the Small Business Association actually had some pretty tangible information after the major flood events that went through. What they found out was that 40% of the small business owners that were impacted by these flood events walked away from their businesses, just walked away from them. That was pretty traumatic to the local community and, of course, to that property owner. It's one of the reasons that we encourage flood insurance, because that's the first line of mitigation for a property owner. And it doesn't matter if it's a federal flood insurance or if it's the private insurance, multi-hazard insurance, at least the property owner is covered, because the worst thing after a flood event, and we've seen it here in Montana, is if they didn't have insurance and they had one loan already on that structure and that property, after those events, they typically have to take out a second loan. So now you have somebody that's paying on 2 mortgages, and it's expensive. So these regulations were really kind of established to try to help people build a little bit better in these areas, to build stronger, to make sure that if there is a flood event, that hopefully there's going to be minimal damage or no damage at all. Now, once a project is complete, a lot of the conditions on the permit is making sure that the applicant submits a floodplain permit compliant certification. And what this says is that it assures that that floodplain, that project was actually built according to that permit that was issued. And it allows that local floodplain administrator to close out your file with all the necessary documentation, including that elevation certificate and a floodproofing certificate if available. Now, we didn't really touch too much on the floodproofing certificate, but those are ones that are used for commercial structures. Commercial structures have the option of actually floodproofing their structure. And so that floodproofing certificate, just like the elevation certificate, would be used as part of that permit, documentation. And this is all the information that the community keeps on hand, and they should keep it in perpetuity for anyone else who purchases that structure in the future. And it's also used as a way to show that the community is in compliance, not only with the National Flood Insurance Program, but also the community rating system. Now, I know we've kind of gone over a little bit on some time here, but I did want to talk quickly about that community rating system again. Communities that are in that program, the classifications start at 10 and go down to 1. And the communities that are part of that community rating system, and we only have 12 in the state of Montana, by going above and beyond those federal regulations, they